Saludos a todas y todos. Welcome everyone to this Caribbean conference. Apologize for the delay, but we're trying to connect with our dear colleague Reinaldo Funes in Cuba. And I just asked him, he's gonna join us later. I mean, he had been in contact with our speaker, so he knows her paper, her presentation, so that shouldn't be a problem. But I also want to take into account those of you that joined us early and on time. So we're gonna start, and he's gonna join us once he sorts the technological issues. So welcome, bienvenidos. On behalf of the faculty, staff, and students and research assistants, we welcome you to the Caribbean conferences hosted by the Institute of Caribbean Studies of the University of Puerto Rico in Rio Piedras. My name is Jorge Giovanetti, acting director of the Institute. This Caribbean conferences is one of the key initiatives of the ICS as we fulfill our role in the dissemination of knowledge in and beyond the Caribbean region. They are possible thanks to the College of Social Sciences here at the UPR, our staff, but also to the generosity of many intellectuals, scholars, policymakers, and thinkers that volunteer to participate in them. We have been organizing them consistently for more than 15 years and are now in its 34th semester. For those of you interested, all the Caribbean conferences are available in the Internet Archive and also in the UPR institutional repository. The ICS also fulfills its role in the dissemination of knowledge through the publication of Caribbean Studies, a peer-reviewed journal, and the only one in our campus available in the prestigious databases JSTOR and Project Muse. So please do examine our content and consider us for the publication of your research and scholarship. And we welcome Reinaldo Funes that apparently joined us. So those of you who want to know more about the activities of the Institute of Caribbean Studies, please join us in our networks in Facebook and in X, formerly Twitter. And also you can join the networks of the Social Science and Caribbean Archives, which is part of the ICS and holds the Finnimans Library and the Gordon K. Lewis Library. Those of you that also want to support our efforts and wish to make a donation, big or small, do access the special project section of the Chancellor's Office and look for the special project number 8, which is Caribbean Studies. We are happy to have two distinguished guests today. Our guest speaker is Professor Lizabeth Paravisini-Gebert from Vassar College, and our commentator, Dr. Reinaldo Funes from Cuba. I'm gonna make a brief introduction of them, and then I'm gonna pass the screen or give the word to Professor Paravisini-Gebert. Professor Paravisini-Gebert is Professor of Hispanic Studies at Vassar College, where she holds the Sarah Todd Fetch Randolph Distinguished Chair. At Vassar, she holds affiliations with various multidisciplinary programs, including Africana Studies, Latin American Studies, and International Studies and Environmental Studies programs. She studied at the University of Puerto Rico and then did graduate studies at New York University. Professor Paravisini-Gebert is the author of numerous books, including Phyllis Shand Alfrey, A Caribbean Life from 1996, Jamaica Kincaid, A Critical Comparison from 1999, Creole Religions of the Caribbean, written with Margaret Fernandez Olmos in 2003, and now a second edition of 2011, Literatures of the Caribbean from 2008. She has several forthcoming publications, including the book Extinctions, The Ecological Cost of Colonization in the Caribbean, forthcoming with Liverpool University Press. With funding from the Arts Writers Grants from the Creative Capital and Andy Warhol Foundation, she's working on another book called Troubled Sea, Ecology and History in the 21st Century Caribbean Art. She also received a grant from the Clark Art Institute for her work entitled Where the River Meets the Sea, Visualizing Climate Change in the Dominican Republic. Professor Paravisini-Gebert has also co-edited several works, including Displacements and Transformations in Caribbean Cultures, Women at Sea, Travel Writing and the Margins of Caribbean Discourse, 2001, Healing Cultures, Art and Religion as Curative Practices in the Caribbean and its Diaspora, and Sacred Possessions, Voodoo, Santeria, Obia, and the Caribbean from 1997. Her essays and translations have appeared in journals such as the Yale French Review, Callaloo, the Journal of West Indian Literature, Haitian Studies Journals, Journal of Caribbean Literature, New West Indian Guide, and Research in African Literature. Together with Yvette Romero Cesareo at Marist College, she co-edits the popular blog Repeating Islands, which is an important resource for those of us involved in Caribbean studies. Our commentator is Dr. Reinaldo Funes Monzote. We welcome him. He's a professor at the University of Havana and coordinator of the Geohistorical Research Program at the Antonio Núñez Jiménez Foundation in Cuba. He's also president of the Cuban Society for the History of Science and Technology and an Academy of the History of Cuba member. After graduating in 1991, he worked as a researcher in the Carlos J. Finlay Museum in Science in Havana. He earned his PhD in Spain in 2002 with an award-winning dissertation on the deforestation process in Cuba due to the sugar expansion, which we know has been published in Spanish and in English by UNC Press. He also received the Casa Las Américas Prize in 2019 for his work Nuestro viaje a la luna, la idea de la transformación de la naturaleza en Cuba durante la Guerra Fría. Our trip to the moon, the idea of the transformation of nature in Cuba during the Cold War. During his career, he has been involved in the environmental history movement in Latin America, engaged in multiple collaborations with international research teams. These projects have delved into the relationships between slavery and the socio-ecological consequences of the plantation systems, agrarian metabolism, and commodity frontiers. He aims to write a synthesis of the greater Caribbean environmental history. Professor Funes Monzote has held numerous visiting appointments internationally, including the Macmillan Center at Yale University, the Shelby Cullom Davis Center for Historical Studies at Princeton University, and the Department of Global History at the University of Hamburg in Germany. So we welcome both our guests today and give the word to Professor Paravisini. Thank you, and apologies for the delay.
Hello. Thank you, Jorge, for that introduction. I'm really delighted to participate in the conferences. They're always a salient point in my academic year. It's great to have them as a resource, and I'm very happy to be participating today. I'm particularly pleased to be sharing this with Reinaldo, whose work has been very important to me, and is a scholar whom I admire very much. So today I wanted to talk about the Ciénaga de Zapata. It is located south of the province of Matanzas, and the 6,000 square meters Ciénaga is the Caribbean region's most important and best preserved wetland. As a place of spectacular natural beauty, the vast Ciénaga encompasses large areas of salt marshes, estuaries, floodplains, mangrove forests, and Caribbean coastal zones. Its ecosystem diversity and richness of flora and fauna are unmatched in the archipelago. Over 900 plant species, 175 bird species, 31 reptile species, including the endangered Cuban crocodile. It has an extraordinary biodiversity, which is augmented in winter by 65 species of birds during their annual migration from North America. All this has led to its designation in 2000 as a UNESCO Biosphere Reserve and as a Ramsar site in 2001. Acknowledgements of its importance in the Caribbean environment. I want to focus here briefly on the Ciénaga's history of environmental decline in what we call the long 19th century, a period during which the swamp, as described in Thomas Barbour's A Naturalist in Cuba, became a threatened space in imminent danger of being completely drained. Many of its endemic species vulnerable to extirpation or extinction. A forbidding backwater, difficult to reach and inhospitably challenging to penetrate. I trace here some of the rare textual glimpses offered by those venturing into its interior from the mid-19th century to the early decades of the 20th, as the fate of this most vital natural Caribbean landscape and of the unique biodiversity it supports hanged in the balance. The text I'm going to look at briefly include a letter written by a young Jose Marti during the 9 months he spent living with his father on the edge of the swamp, the narrative of the fast decline of the Cuban red macaw population in its last bastion of Anabana, a decline that highlights the swamp's deterioration in the late 1800s, the memoirs of J.A. Coscoyuela, an environmental engineer written in 1918, and of Pura de Armas, and their focus on the subsistence culture of the Ciénaga, from which emerges a portrait of the typical Cienaguero as the poorest of Cuban peasants. I also talked briefly about Luis Felipe Rodríguez's novel La Conjura de la Ciénaga, written in 1923, which portrays the zone as emblematic of the ills facing an independent Cuba in the early decades of the 20th century. My analysis ends with a brief coda about the success of the revolution's conservation efforts, which led to the revitalization of the Ciénaga, the protection of its endemic species, and its concomitant designation as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The coda underscores the swamp's recovery as a habitat and ecosystem, and through its recovery, the preservation of the hundreds of species of fauna and flora that now thrive in the wetlands. In April of 1862, after a prolonged and difficult period of unemployment, Jose Marti's father, Mariano, secured an appointment as the circuit captain for the region of Anabana in the Ciénaga, about 90 miles southwest of Havana. He had insisted on taking his 9-year-old son with him, interrupting his son's schooling, but providing instead a 9-month immersion in life at the edge of the Zapata swamp at a time when it was a crucial liminal space between an expanding sugar-dependent economy and the expanse of what has been called, and I quote, a half-floating vegetation of grass and reeds with clumps of willows, where many of the pools were so choked with aquatic vegetation that they showed no open water at all, end of quote. In 1862, Matanzas was a crucial zone for sugar cane production on the island with a substantial slave population. Mariano's area, main area of operations, however, was on the edge of the plantation zone in the deeply impoverished area on the northern edge of the Zapata swamp. Both magical in its beauty and eerie in its dense strangeness, the wetlands provided a natural barrier to the expansion of sugar plantations, and most of the inhabitants of Anabana were primarily subsistence farmers, foragers, crocodile hunters, and charcoal makers. Simple, uneducated people who offer young Marti his earliest model for rural subsistence and his first glimpse at the travails and hardships of a sustainable engagement with a harsh surrounding environment, then in danger of being consumed by the sugar plantation. At the time, plans for draining the wetlands were already under discussion, as the discourse of modernity and advances in technology allowed for projects aimed at integrating its rich and well-watered soil into the plantation system, while at the same time reducing the problems caused by flooding, of which Marti will write to his mother, changes which in turn would make control of the coastline and the reduction of the illegal slave trade easier to achieve. As circuit captain, Mariano's principal duty was that of stopping the illegal importation of slaves into the province. Article 14 of the instructions given to circuit captains refers specifically to the pursuit, capture, and return of runaway slaves and maroons in the district. The Anabana district, with its difficult terrain and coastal access through Playa Girón, the Bay of Pigs, was ideal for furtive landings. Boats loaded with slaves would enter the bay and move clandestinely through the vast Ciénaga towards the mouth of one of the intricate networks of navigable rivers and channels in the wetlands, from which it would be possible to land their cargo and slaves on dry land under the protection of dense waterlogged woods and mangroves. Its proximity to the expanding sugar plantations in the Matanzas and Cienfuegos districts had made the swamp the center of illegal importation of slaves into Cuba. In 1862, however, the local government, under pressure from Great Britain, had committed to upholding the ban on the trading of slaves. That year, the United States had ended its participation in the slave trade and would abolish slavery on January 1st, 1863, leaving Cuba as the only territory in the region still engaged in the African slave trade. The area under Mariano's jurisdiction had a substantial population of slaves and freed blacks already, with almost 900 slaves and around 350 free or semi-free individuals. Conflicted interest at the highest levels of the colonial hierarchy would eventually make Mariano's position an untenable one. The naming of a new Captain General for Cuba, Domingo Dulce y Garay, Marquess of de Castel Florid, in December 1862, sealed Mariano's fate, bringing his son's rural adventure to an end. Dulce Garay, who had married a wealthy Cuban plantation heiress, had property in the district and was not interested in a zealous and uncompromising circuit captain interrupting the flow of much-needed slaves into the area. The zone of Jaguay Grande, a small hamlet on the eastern end of Mariano's district, on the northeastern boundary of the Ciénaga, had been recently opened to sugar cultivation through extensive deforestation and was in dire need of manpower. The opening of Jaguay Grande to sugar cultivation was but the latest indication that the steady growth of the sugar industry south of Matanzas required the draining of the swamp and the cutting of its forest, as well as an increase in the supply of legal slaves at a time when Mariano had been quite successful in stemming the flow of illegal slaves within his jurisdiction. Against this complex political and economic backdrop, young José's months in Habana represented one of the most unique formative experiences of his pre-adolescence years. Growing up in Havana, especially in the neighborhoods near the fortress of Las Cabañas and the port, he had grown up surrounded by urban blacks, artisans, skilled laborers, and domestic workers, free as well as slaves. His sojourn in Habana brought him into close contact with the conditions under which enslaved blacks worked in the plantation, a contact that would leave a lasting impression on the young boy and of the toll that the expanding plantation system took on the Ciénaga's ecology, measured primarily through deforestation, rapid erosion, and the diminution of rainfall. Mariano and his son reached Habana late in the cane season of 1862, just in time for the cane harvest, when the sugar production process moved from the fields to the mill. The voyage by train from Habana to Colón, then known as Nueva Bermeja, on the Guines rail line, gave the boy his first glimpse of the vast fields of cane that supported Cuba's growing prosperity. From Colón, they proceeded to Habana on horseback through the roads that would become impassable in the fast approaching wet season. As they would learn as soon as the rains began, once the Sabanilla River broke its banks, the small population of the district, some 3,400 people scattered across 2 villages and a handful of hamlets, would be isolated from the neighboring towns. Jaguay Grande, the smaller of the 2 settlements in Mariano's new jurisdiction, was, and I quote, a village so miserable as not to be worthy of its name. Ornithology studying the Cuban red macaw in the years before Mariano's arrival in the area described the area where the Habana River flowed into the swamp as bordered by a wide area of open country with scattered clumps of palms and hardwood cayos or hammocks. The border zone sloped gently toward the swamp, and its extent varied as the rains caused the water levels to rise or fall through the entire Ciénaga. Of the town where Martí lived with his fathers, there's nothing left now but the trace of the foundations of the bakery and the church, and a small plantation of locust trees that marked the location of the cemetery. Surrounded by cane fields to the north and the natural abundance of the Zapata swamp to the south, home to cenagueros making a precarious living as subsistence farmers and coal makers, Martí threw himself into country pursuits, learning to ride horses and race and train fighting cocks. We owe to Thomas Barbour a description of the landscape surrounding Habana some 25 or 30 years after Martí's sojourn in the town, and I quote from that. Late in the afternoon, I used to rest under some trees which allowed uninterrupted vision far out over the open marsh, and there watch for the bands of ibises which fed regularly along the drier shores, where cattle also wandered to eat the succulent hyacinths stranded along the marge. No man nor beast ventured far out on the tembladera, for this skein of vegetation rippled and sagged, and to break through meant oblivion. The ibises came regularly from the southwestern horizon in wavering lines, perhaps 300 or 400 in a flock. Jose Marti's oldest known letter dates from this sojourn in Habana, in an affectionate note to his mother dated October 23rd, 1862, the only example remaining of what appears to have been a frequent correspondence. He speaks of the joys of living in the countryside, where he has learned to ride horses and had discovered the rural pastime of cockfighting. The brief letter offers a surprisingly detailed account of the environmental conditions on the edge of the Ciénaga. He tells his mother of the problems they have faced sending and receiving mail because of the flooding of the Sabanilla River, which impeded traffic to Nueva Bermeja, the nearest train depot. Difficulties typical of the early rainy season at the edge of the swamp. The flooding had affected nearby farms and had threatened 2 local farmers, but the waters had begun receding by the time he had finished his note. Flooding was a perennial problem in the area, and the town of Habana would disappear by 1879 as people eventually relocated upland with better access to the sugar plantations that offer work and better communication with larger towns. Although Mariano did not encourage friendships between his son and the slaves and freed blacks living around them, it was difficult to avoid contact, and Jose made friends among the rural blacks with whom he lived so closely. As he accompanied his father on long rides throughout the district, immersing himself in the strange liminal terrain between the plantation and the swamp, he came face to face with the crowded barracks, dreadful conditions, and corporal punishments meted out to slaves on the plantation. Who has ever seen a friend physically whipped and does not consider himself forever in that man's death? He asked. I saw it when I was a child, and I can still feel the shame burning on my cheeks, he would write later. Moreover, his work as his father's clerk, which entailed drafting and copying Mariano's frequent reports to his superiors, drew him into the world of the slave trade. His father's main task was that of curtailing the debarkation of slaves in his district, and Martí will describe vividly such an event in his Versos Sencillos, where he recreates the eerie solemnity of the deep swamp. Thunder plows blood-stained through the dark storm cloud. The ship spills out the blacks 100 by 100 through its gates. The fierce wind shattered the thick-topped mastic trees, and out in a single file marched the naked slaves. The poem also narrates the dramatic incident of the poet's encounter with the corpse of a slave hanging from a ceiba, the ubiquitous silk cotton tree sacred to both Cuba's indigenous and African populations. Martí's later writings about slavery trace the roots of his fiercely abolitionist stance to this months he lived in Habana, his only continuous experience of rural living in Cuba. The love of nature that underpins his poems about the island from which he would be exiled throughout most of his life, the appreciation of the character and strength of his peasantry, the sympathy for an unjustly degraded and abused race, the connection to the island's flora and fauna, stem from these most significant 9 months, a true gestation period for a budding patriot with an understanding of the environmental conditions determining the lives of Cuba's subsistence rural population. In Habana, Martí began his ideological separation from his Spanish father's identity as a military man, from his anti-Creole ideas and intense loyalty to his native Spain. This process was aided by the relationships Martí developed in Habana with local Creole sugar planters and cenegueros living precariously off the swamp, who provided an invaluable education in the complexities of agricultural production and the obstacles to reform represented by Spanish colonial authorities and laws. The Creole planters he met were of the type that 6 years later would lead the fight for slave emancipation and political independence known as the 10 Years' War. Martí's reflection on this initiation into the realities of the Cuban countryside can be read as linking his approach to the understanding of the Cuban proto-nation to earlier assessments of Cubans' emerging Creolite. Here I am thinking particularly of his readings of José Martín Félix de Arrata y Acosta's Llave del Nuevo Mundo, Key to the New World from 1761, where early notions of Cuba's identity are linked to a celebration of Cuba's environmental richness and to an implicit project for the conservation of its diversity against the forces of the Spanish Empire, which deep in the 18th century sought to move towards a monocrop system, following the successful example of the French and British colonies. It is difficult to glean the accuracy with which the very young Martí could read the Ciénaga's landscape and assess the nature of his harmonious, sustainable rhythm. That logic of relation is the term he uses, as he does in his essay Livingston, a travel article about his voyage through the coastal zone of Yucatan, in which he describes the indigenous inhabitants of a coastal village whose lives and relationship to nature echoed those of the Cienagueros. In Our America, Martí builds his arguments on a highly nuanced and at times ambivalent deployment of references and metaphors on nature and natural man. Central to these references is the notion of the land and its potential abundance as being, quote, what nature made available to all nations to foster with their work and defend with their lives. Natural man's knowledge and careful husbanding of this natural bounty in his writing becomes the key to the nation's prosperity. But man has to be careful to manage the land according to the needs of his people as the only means of avoiding tyranny. We can't really trace the complexity of Martí's thoughts on the balance between development and sustainability for the Cuban proto-nation to a brief sojourn at the Ciénaga de Zapata, but it is possible to see that salient episode in Martí's life as a seed of an understanding of Cuban options that would sprout through observations of other Caribbean spaces as having offered a glimpse at a spectrum of possible modes of development in an agricultural Cuba. There is a poignant coincidence between Martí's sojourn in Havana in 1862 and the retreat of the Cuban red macaw, the Ara tricolor, from the area into the interior of the Ciénaga on its path to inevitable extinction within the next 2 decades. One of the last specimens of the Cuban red macaw was actually shot in the Zapata swamp in 1865. The Ara tricolor, the only endemic local macaw, was native to Cuba and the Isla de la Juventud. Abundant at the moment of European arrival, the species began its inexorable path to extinction immediately after 1492, when unsustainable numbers were captured for the European pet trade, and its population began to decline steadily as their forest habitats were destroyed to make way for the expanding sugar plantation. By the 1850s, the macaws had retreated to the northern range of the Ciénaga, where macaws from the last bands were regularly seen feeding in a small group of paraíso tree in the yard or batey of the colonia at Sarabanda, very near where Martí lived. By the time Martí reached Havana, rapid deforestation to clear even more land for sugar cultivation had pushed the macaw to the verge of extinction, with only a few breeding pairs remaining in the environs of Havana, where we can tantalizingly imagine young Martí and the last remaining individuals of his species having lived in the Caribbean islands for as many as 25 million years, briefly encountering each other. The species is believed to have survived in the most remote areas of the Ciénaga until the late 1880s. But we should remember that the Ara tricolor was the last surviving species of at least 7 macaws living in the archipelago at the time of the European encounter, all now extinct. Thomas Barbour, during his stay in Havana, expressed his concern over the eruption of the sugar plantations into the Ciénaga through his concern for the Cuban red macaw and his fears for the local extirpation of the glossy ibis, the Plegades falcinellus. And I quote, if ever cane is planted in the Ciénaga, the last chapter will be written in the Cuban history of the glossy ibis. The narrative of the macaw's imminent extinction, of which Martí was surely not aware, is nonetheless deeply linked to the political and economic moment of his seminal experience in the Cuban countryside. The very same conditions that led to the macaw's disappearance, the expansion of the plantation system to meet international demand, the concomitant deforestation, the tightening of Spanish economic control, aided by the profits from sugar cultivation, the increased pressure on the rural population to join the plantation labor force, Spanish adherence to the slave trade at a moment when it had been abandoned by most European nations and banned throughout the archipelago, would all lead directly to the 10 Years' War and Martí's own depoliticization. The juxtaposition of the two narratives underscores the environmental cost of market-driven colonial exploitation, in this case through an extinction linked directly to the expansion of the plantation and on the pressures that expansion imposed on the surrounding wetlands. Political independence at the dawn of the 20th century, however, will open a problematic period for the Zapata swamp, as the late 19th century's focus on modernity, together with capitalism's emphasis on control and exploitation, extirpation of natural resources, brings forth a question of how to solve a problem like that of the pre-modern Ciénaga. Accustomed to land being valued in terms of its productivity, the unproductive swamp becomes the focus of a variety of modern government-sponsored projects based on dubious scientific principles whose aim was to foster the economic vitality of an area deemed economically, politically, and socially backward. With no understanding at the time of the number of vital ecosystem services the wetlands provided, with the lowest population density and highest levels of illiteracy of any Cuban district, and with economic activity limited to subsistence agriculture and charcoal making, the plans focused primarily on the draining of the swamp through the development of a complex network of canals. This would allow, or so it was thought, for the expansion of the sugar industry into the drained lands, which in addition to the production of hemp, the processing of bagasse for paper making, cattle raising, and fishing would provide a solid foundation for a new economy in the region. We're fortunate to have a vital chronicle of this period in Cuatro Años en la Ciénaga de Zapata, published in 1918, a richly textured report by a young engineer who spent 4 years in the Ciénaga in the early years of the century as part of a team of technicians in charge of evaluating the draining project and the development of new industries and communication infrastructure. The report of his failed engineering project, focused on the need for modernization in the swamp, offers nonetheless a colorful, albeit deeply biased, social, geological, anthropological history of the swamp with a richly nuanced ecological assessment, even if its modern conclusions would point to the destructive transformation of a unique environment. The report, nonetheless, as Reinaldo himself argues in his study of deforestation in Cuba from 1492 to 1926, became a valuable document for understanding the environmental impacts of earlier economic development, such as the expansion of the plantation into areas unsuited to sugar production. These incursions, Cosculluela chronicles, had a detrimental impact on the lands of the northern edge of the Ciénaga, where Anabana was located. Patterns of rainfall were changed, and as Reinaldo himself quotes, flooding swept the lands, drowned the cattle, and caused an infinitude of evils, as Martí himself had experienced. Of particular interest is Cosculluela's account of the tug-of-war between local sugar planters and the Spanish Navy for control of local forests. His understanding of hydrology allows for unique insights into the patterns of water flow and their impact on local populations, which together with his observations about the impact of deforestation on soil conditions and rainfall, attest to the pressures on the swamp's fragile environment. Moreover, the text is of deep interest in bringing together, under a proto-environmentalist lens, current scientific knowledge from leading naturalists, anthropologists, archaeologists, and sociologists. The report, moreover, opens a new narrative vein that will persist to this day, despite the deep social transformation undergone by the region after the Cuban Revolution of 1959, that of the Cenagueros as Monteros, a special group of Cubans deeply identified with the bush, inhabitants of what Cosculluela calls, and I quote, darkest Africa of our land, a mysterious, feared, and fantastic land populated by beings who in their comprehensive orphanhood lost all contact with civilization and progress, remaining mired in their culture and in an almost total state of barbarity, end of quote. It is a narrative of particular relevance in our context, as it portrays the human population as subsumed by the natural environment, as one and the same, humans and wilderness as fundamentally entwined. The persistence of this narrative can be seen in a more recent text, Historias contadas por Pura, Stories told by Pura, an oral testimony of events that transpire a mere decade after the publication of Cosculluela's book, as recorded and edited by Ernesto Chavez Alvarez in 2006. Pura's engaging text gathers the experience of a peripatetic childhood moving across the small, isolated settlements of the Ciénaga, as the family's fortunes allowed. The daughter of a charcoal maker whose meager earnings were supplemented by a small conuco or kitchen garden and by hunting and fishing, her family's life transpires in deep engagement with the Ciénaga's rich natural world, from constant flooding to the scourge of painful and dangerous chiggers. The simple narrative does not rise to the nuanced narrative style created at the height of the testimonial literature of the 1960s and 70s, which gave us Miguel Barnett and Esteban Montejo's Biografía de un Cimarrón. It does, however, capture the vicissitudes of a style of life in the Ciénaga that had changed little since Martí's brief sojourn in 1862. A precarious existence based on sugarcane work and the unsustainable exploitation of the mangrove forest to make the charcoal used locally for cooking, and marked by the absence of education, medical care, and the most basic hygiene. From pure, simple descriptions, we glean the burdens of a sustainable existence spent on and I quote, a dilapidated bohío in the midst of the swamp, defenseless against the rains, the wind, and the cold, and dependent for food on what nature around us could offer us, chiefly turtles, Cuban gar, crocodile, crabs, utillas, and all the birds from the Ciénaga. Her recollections of the Ciénaga are marked by a profound memory of the beauty and bounty of its vegetation, fauna, and the generosity of those eking a living out of its richness. This beauty and bounty, as well as the travails and burdens, are expressed creatively by both Pura and her father through the writing of decimas, an often improvised style of poetry common to rural communities in Latin America. From her father, whom she calls a poet of the land with a decima always on his lips, Pura learned the patterns and subject matters characteristic of the folk form, and her testimonial is peppered with her compositions and those of her father, a poetry born of their lives in the Ciénaga. The simplicity of her approach to the Ciénaga in her writing, simplicity inherent in the form of the decima itself, matches her candid assessment of the beauty and richness of the natural world around it. It is an approach that differs greatly from that of Luis Felipe Rodríguez' La Conjura de la Ciénaga from 1926, a novel in which, as Gustavo Pérez Firmat argues, the swamp is both setting and symbol, and realistic description and allegorical significance are glued together with a stickiness whose most accurate representation is perhaps the swamp itself, end of quote. Instead of Pura's portrait of primitive and picturesque humanity, we get a Ciénaga whose ecological realities are burdened by the symbolic and heady turmoil of breathless criollismo. The plot is a familiar one. A jaded writer tired of the city's political cesspool accompanies his census-taken friend to the Ciénaga, where he plans to write a novel about the urban swamp. Confronted with the earthier and highly overheated passions of the real swamp, expressed primarily through an ardent, sensuous woman and a young politician maddened by unrequited love and boundless desire, the Ciénaga destabilizes its moral and ethical compass. The young woman seduced, her would-be lover in quest for revenge, the city writer turned seducer is murdered, proving that civilization, in the guise of his census-taken friend, is powerless against the passions unleashed in the swamp where he finds his death. It is an engagement with the modernizing impulse that drives Cosculluela's own approach in Cuatro Años en la Ciénaga de Zapata. However, and the novel proposes a fitting ending to the lone Cuban 19th century's approach to the contested and ultimately remarginalized space of the Ciénaga. It will return to its dark and menacing obscurity as the pre-modern space that could swallow a talented and promising writer. Its ignorant and superstitious population, like the unfortunately seduced and disgraced Conchita, withdraws back into the swamp. and I quote, as if the invisible passion of the late Santiago Hermida pushed them from the bottom of the deep and dark Ciénaga. From this deepness and darkness, the Ciénaga will emerge in 1959, in March, when not yet 3 months after the revolution's triumph. Fidel Castro visited the inhospitable Ciénagas at the Zapata for the first time, becoming acquainted with the coal makers' experience with draining small fields for the planting of subsistence crops. A meeting with coal makers focused on a discussion of the canals built to reach the interior of the Ciénagas, frightful solitude, as Grandma describes it, and of the intricate processes of the artisanal production of coal and its long tradition in the area. Other meetings followed, including a memorable Christmas Eve celebration with the coal makers in the community of Sopillar in 1959. The celebration at the Ciénaga was part of a strategic plan to display his admiration for the humble coal makers and peasants of the territory in this, the first holiday celebration under the new revolutionary government. The Ciénaga had been selected because it was deemed one of the country's most backward territories, a vital part of the national narrative about the swamp. It was the first time in Cuba's history that a leader of such significance had spent time with the most exploited and forgotten workers who lived in the poorest conditions, without electricity, without doctors or teachers, crammed in rustic bohíos, as Grandma exalted. Some months later, in October 1960, Fidel and his companion Celia Sanchez visited the Ciénaga with French intellectuals Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir during what Sartre later called the honeymoon of the revolution. These meetings and celebrations set into motion a number of initiatives for the improvement of lives and infrastructure in the Ciénaga, of which Fidel would boast in a July 1961 speech to mark the inauguration of the Ciénaga de Zapata National Park. And I'll quote very briefly from it. This was a completely isolated zone of the country. In 2 years, it has been totally transformed. A massive reforestation plan is underway, and some 100 kilometers of highways and 100 others of roadways have been built. The Zapata Peninsula National Park has been established, but the most interesting part of this work is what has been accomplished at the human level. Today, on this 26th of July, 80% of those who could not read or write in the Zapata Peninsula have learned to do so. That is to say that the Zapata Peninsula is now at the top of all rural regions in our anti-illiteracy campaign and occupies first place in the public health campaign. It is the first Cuban territory where all people have been vaccinated, end of quote. By the time of the park's inauguration, the Bay of Pigs, Playa Girón invasion, the Bay of Pigs or Playa Girón invasion of April 1961 had brought intense national and international attention to the Ciénaga, adding to the wetland's importance as a showcase for the profound changes brought about by the revolution, a new prominence as the site of the first foreign challenge faced by the revolutionary government. The failed invasion of 17th to 20th April 1961 was quickly repelled by Cuban forces, aided by the wetlands' difficult terrain and poor infrastructure. This new approach to an understanding of the importance of the Ciénaga as a national space required the reversal of the portrayal of the poor and illiterate swamp-dwelling Montero. Turning to a protected national park with improved infrastructure and tourist facilities for local and foreign visitors alike, the Ciénaga emerged as one of the archipelago's greatest ecotourist attractions and an international mecca for bird watchers and nature lovers. Formal charcoal makers were retrained as environmental officers, nature guides, or forest rangers. Programs to promote endemic species were developing using retrained local labor. Moreover, in 1993, this erstwhile secret, mysterious place was revealed to a broad Cuban audience through a limited series produced by Cuba Visión, focus on, or a telenovela, focus on Ventura and all Montero from the Ciénaga. Cuando el agua regresa a la tierra, when water returns to the land, captures the moment when a small community of Cenegueros is being moved to a newly built settlement less prone to flooding and closer to roads and modern infrastructure. an earlier example of managed retreat from endangered coastal lands, for which we find examples throughout Cuba as early as the 1980s. Against the background of continued deforestation to produce charcoal and Ventura's wish to go deeper into the swamp, to the spaces he had roamed in his youth, the series offers a continued immersion into those hard-to-reach and explore spaces that unveil the Ciénaga's hidden marvels. It is in part a travelogue through the wetlands and an introduction to its broad range of ecosystems. As an ecologically centered narrative, it is also a didactic attempt to teach the audience about the need for its preservation, bringing its focus onto the transfer of Ventura's love and protection of the wetlands to a new generation. It remains one of the most beloved Cuban television series. Capturing the enduring mystery of the Ciénaga, built on ineffable moments of intense engagement between humans and the profuse and overwhelmingly enigmatic nature, continues to challenge Cuban writers and artists, as we see here in an image from a documentary project by Cuban photographer Raúl Cañivano, Tierra Guajira, which he began in 1998, where Cañivano weaves stories around each snapshot and as part of a whole reflects on the ways of life, custom, and traditions that over time may or may not last. I cherish this photo for its nostalgic return to the 19th century Ciénaga of crocodile hunters, the old struggles between civilization and barbarie, or for recalling Pura's affectionate descriptions of the pleasures of eating Cuban crocodile stew. It is an ambiguous, challenging photograph that reminds us of the ambiguities and challenges of environmental protection and conservation in sites such as the Ciénaga de Zapata. It reminds us that in the 21st century, the safeguarding and protection of its ecosystems, fauna and flora rest on the redirected skills of hunters turned conservationists, and that the Cuban crocodile, Crocodilus rombifer, affectionately known as Castro's crocodile, is critically endangered and in dire need of protection. Conserving the endangered Cuban crocodile was one of Castro's top priorities after first visiting the Ciénaga in 1959. His creation of a crocodile breeding facility in the Ciénaga was a central part of his commitment to the swamp and its endemic species. Yet the Cuban crocodile may be doomed, even if protected from hunters and poachers, by hybridization through mating with the American crocodile, Crocodilus acutus, present in Cuba and throughout the Caribbean archipelago and the surrounding mainland. Their fate will play out in the Ciénaga, now recovered as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and nature will take its course. The Cuban crocodile may be heading into extinction, as did the Cuban red macaw retreating from the sugar plantation and its deforestation when Martí spent those significant months living on the edge of the wetlands. But it is an exhilarating experience to come across one in the wild. I often wonder if the young Jose Martí may have been one of the last lucky ones to see the Cuban red macaw in flight against a clear, luminous sky. As my colleague Alison Spodek-Kemovitz wrote in a poignant essay about illness and climate change, loss may be inevitable in spaces as vulnerable as wetlands, but the years we can postpone each loss and each wild place and creature saved are incalculable, valuable. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Paravisini. Now give the word to Professor Funes.
Okay, thank you very much, Jorge. Lisa, it's a great pleasure to meet you this way. I know your work, I have your books, and it's really a great pleasure. And excuse me all, please, because I'm now at the Isla de la Juventud, that, you know, the history is similar. There are a lot of similarities between the island, the Isla de la Juventud, the south in particular, Ciénaga de la Niebla and Ciénaga de Zapata. And I'm here in a festival, cinema festival, Isla Verde. And then I had a talk before this meeting. I was prepared to back home where I am now to connect with and then I had to be here at the university, and they found me a place. It was impossible to connect from the beginning. And you know, Zoom not provide service to Cuba. We have always to need a VPN for the connection. And I'm sorry very much because I came 20 minutes late, but I hear all your presentation. And also, I have to say that my English is not so good as your English. Of course, that's one of the difference between Cubans and Puerto Ricans. You speak great English, and our English is not the best. But I don't know, Jorge. I have to send you also, because this opportunity, the invitation. What do you prefer, that I continue in English or I do it in Spanish? Whatever you want, you prefer, and that gives me the opportunity to practice my English. In other way, I can do it in Spanish, you know. Okay, let me know, Jorge. Thank you very much for this great opportunity to meet Lisa.
Yeah, I think you can use the language that you.
Okay, I maybe use both. I really appreciate and enjoy this presentation. I think I don't know, Lisa, if you know, in my last book, Nuestro Viaje a la Luna, you maybe know the book already, or yes. I try to follow more or less the history, the official history of the Zapata swan. And it's great for me to have this opportunity to know what are you doing, what are you researching, because it's a different side that I researched in my chapters. And I found great to follow more or less, because my book is about the history about development ideas in the Americas, in the Caribbean, and the Zapata swan gave me a great chance to follow how these ideas change, but I never had in mind the idea, for example, to use Jose Marti. And you are completely right. Now that is a very good parable from Marti to Fidel Castro. I don't know if that was conscious. For example, the idea to meet but it's a long tradition, the idea to go with the charcoal makers and the people from the Swan to meet with them. I think it's also that something that I also include in the book is his close relation with Antonio Núñez Jiménez, with the geographer that introduced him to the Zapata Swan. But I like very much how you manage that transition from Jose Marti, Thomas Barbour, Cosculluela, and Luis Felipe. The novel, I never read the novel. I have in my list for the future, but you are making a great job, and I think I will learn a lot from you reading these authors, no? And I think it's really the image of the swan, how changed from the late 19th century, and also that connection between Marti and the slave trade is true. And we have some work, maybe you know, for example, at the University of Havana, they have a team researching about the slave trade in different places of Cuba, different areas. The team is led by Maria del Carmen Barcia, and I think Oilda Evia have a chapter, they have a new book, and maybe you can find something, maybe you know already the book, or maybe
no, I don't.
Yes, I recommend you because they follow. I don't remember if they quote Jose Marti, for example. That's why it's so important the work that you are doing on ecocritics in general, not just Cuba, all the Caribbean area, no? And I think it's how important it is to connect these different views that we have from our different approach. But I will send you the title of the book because that is maybe useful. I also, for example, when you mentioned Thomas Barbour, I remember Gundlach, Juan Cristobal Gundlach, the ornithologist that lived in Cuba, lived in that area, and he had many of books and comments about the extinction of the red macaw, the Ara tricolor. And it's something that maybe is also maybe useful for you, and also because Cosculluela traveled between Cuba and Puerto Rico. I love always this kind of comparison between our history, our environmental history, and Puerto Rico environmental history, and all the connection we are creating during the years in many of these topics. But I also recommend you he. But I think we need in the future to study, and you can help also to write the history of the extinction of the red macaw. Because what influenced more, the change in the habitat or the hunting practices? And it's something that we don't have the history yet. And I think we can do more, but you are right, that convergence of the expansion of the sugar industry to the swamp from the late 19th century to the beginning of the 20th century, that is really interesting. You not mentioned, but I'm sure that you know that behind the Cosculluela was that project to drain the swamp by a U.S. corporation. And all the projects that they made are, for my point of view as a historian, not very useful to understand how strong were those ideas about desiccation in that moment. The ideas about, for example, the presence of mosquitoes, crocodiles, and all the discussion about civilization and barbarism that you manage very well in your presentation, no? How these ideas were still present even at the beginning of the revolution. And that's why that was my idea, to follow those histories about the land reclamation project in the different moments. Because, you know, today many people has this idea about that was Fidel Castro who won the desiccate the swamp because he was crazy. And curiously, many of the people who say this, after they say, okay, but we are now in Miami, we desiccate the swamp, we are the Cuba, we transform all this landscape, and how people change the narrative according to the place, no? And that is a sample of civilization, and the swamp remains as an example of barbarism, no? And I think it's really interesting history. Also, you mentioned at the beginning, at the end, the crocodile, but maybe you can incorporate more the long history of the crocodile hunting at the same time of the history you are using. The author, for example, Cosculluela mentioned that history about the... I wrote also recently an article about it's a so-called history of the Cuban crocodile, was published in the Environmental History journal, maybe you know.
No, I haven't seen that.
They asked me for something. I'm not research in particular that topic, but they asked me, Emily and Germán Vergara, the Emily Wakil, they were preparing this dossier on extinctions in the Americas, but they don't have many cases on the Caribbean or Latin America. They asked me for something to contribute for the dossier. And I had for years some information about the Cuban crocodile. But as you mentioned, it's an amazing metaphor also, even for the relation between Cuba and the United States, because you have this small population of the Cuban crocodile surrounded by the American crocodile at the level of hybridization. And it's maybe the history of the Puerto Rico also in many places, the hybridization with the Americans. It's a really interesting history. No, it's not the side of my research, but then I collect all those information about the Cuban crocodile. I try to write the history in collaboration with a specialist who worked at the farm in the Zapata swamp. And was a really great collaboration. I think that we need more this kind of collaboration from your point of view as eco-critics, my view as a historian, or other historians also, Cuba, Puerto Rico, other Caribbean countries, and the specialists who are working today. I think there is a documentary about his work and other colleagues, other researchers who are working in the Zapata swamp crocodile farm. Yes, I think you have a beautiful history. I'm not the best to say that it's very well written in English, but I enjoy a lot your presentation also. Well, you can include more maybe about the Cuban crocodile history alone. I quote other authors that maybe are useful for you, but I think your side, your view using writers in particular or memoirs of the swamp are interesting. The use of this cuando el hombre regresa a la tierra,
Yeah,
It's
the soap
amazing.
opera.
And you know, there are many, yes, there are many documentaries. I sometimes I use in my class at the university a series of documentaries on the swamp. From the Megano in the 50s. Do you know the Megano documentary? Yes, for sure. And there is another that is Tierra Olvidada, from the beginning of the revolution.
Oh, I don't know that one.
Yes, it's really interesting because it's a different view how the revolution will come to transform the swamp, to civilize the swamp, with all the narrative of the transformation of nature, very typical from the Cold War. Let's say, because we have many common history. We under our socialist system, you under your system, and with the U.S. influence, we had many histories in common around these topics. And that is really great documentary to make the comparison. But later there is another documentary from the 70s. Do you know the El Brigadista, the film?
Yes.
Yes. But at the same time of the El Brigadista, there is a documentary that is called, the name is Al Sur de Maniadero. Do you know that?
No.
The same director filmed the documentary, and the music is from Silvio Rodriguez. Because something that I love from the environmental history is how you can use a cultural history to write eco-critics or environmental history in general. The connection between something very material as the environment and cultural history, that is a very great connection. And then, because you were mentioned the Monteros, because I think the right translation to the Puerto Rican Jíbaro is maybe the Guajiro, but also the Montero. The Montero is also a term that we use very frequent. I don't know in Puerto Rico if you use Montero.
No.
It's not frequent. Okay. Do you know maybe the documentary by Alejandro, I think the last name is Gutierrez Monteros, from the 90s? Yes. Then I use in my classes sometimes these different documentaries to show how changed the ideas about the swamp and how changed the conditions, and that is another is 15 years ago or 10 years ago, a new documentaries on the swamp and the introduction of the buffalo to the swamp.
I haven't seen that.
Yes. And when you mention that ecotourism project, for example, Guamá, and there are a lot of histories around your main history using these sources that you use so well. And I enjoy really your work. There is a lot to do by your side, by our side as historians, but I really appreciate so much that you are doing this history also as somebody from Puerto Rico, that we always appreciate a lot. We have colleagues here who are working in between Puerto Rico and Cuba, and we hope we can do more in the future. One of the limitations is the limitation of, for example, that we can't use formally Zoom. And because it's banned by the blockade to Cuba from the embargo, and we need this VPN. But I hope in the future this change and we can do more. And thank you very much for the presentation. I maybe have another comment or question, but I prefer that you answer other questions from other colleagues who are present now here today. And thank you very much for this great opportunity, to Jorge, to Conferencias Caribeñas. I came many years ago to Puerto Rico and I had the opportunity to present this idea about to write in some moment, I don't know when, or I hope soon, a kind of history of the environmental history of the Greater Caribbean. It's a synthesis, but I think we need this kind of work that connect all our histories around the Caribbean basin. And thank you very much again for this opportunity to both of you.
Thanks a lot, Reinaldo. It's so It's so lovely to talk to you. It's funny after reading your work and depending on it so much for enlightenment, to be able to chat with you about this. I'm going to look for your crocodile work.
Oh,
But I think that to me the what has always grasped me about the Zapata swamp is that I don't think I have ever seen a more beautiful place. Just I don't know. There's just so much extraordinary beauty there, and to see these huge flocks of flamingos and ibises and other birds. I mean, it's just extraordinary. But it's a place whose transformation, well, his importance needs to be noted and whose transformations need to be chronicled. Thanks a lot.
No, gracias.
Thanks to
ambos.
you. Let me say something. Next time you come to the Zapata Swan, let me know.
I will.
I will love to go together or to introduce you the colleagues who are working on crocodiles or who knows very well the Zapata Swan, and maybe we can organize something in the future, a workshop or something else. Thank you very much.
I would love to do that. I should also mention that I've been sort of tracing a little bit of the history of the Cuban red macaw for a different project, but I just found what I think is the earliest European painting of the Cuban red macaw in this villa in Rome, and
Yes.
it's just so incredible, from 1513. So it tells you something about how these macaws were being brought to Europe by the hundreds from the very early moments of the arrival of the Europeans. So I don't know if they ever had a chance to survive, but what a beautiful bird.
Yes.
Bueno, gracias. We're happy to encourage this kind of interdisciplinary debates and discussion. So we're very happy at the Institute to help in this. Now we open to questions, comments from our guests. One of the opportunities that this format provides is that it allows to reach other audiences rather than the outside of Puerto Rico, which is more interactive than the usual YouTube live presentation. Este formato nos permite interactuar con colegas de afuera que antes solo nos pueden ver por YouTube, así que lo abrimos a la discusión y a la conversación. Alejandra.
Yeah, I guess I'll start us off. First, thank you both so much. This is super, super wonderful. I'm actually in Madagascar right now, so this is actually the kinds of discourses that you're talking about are very salient here as well. So, but Lisa, the sweep of history is really just so staggering. It's a beautifully written and beautifully conceived. And I'm still sort of thinking through my question. But I was struck also by and one of the things that you're doing also is visual kind of history, right? And so like all of the images are really, really interesting, and you could almost be writing a history of the changing ideas of nature in Cuba, and in particular, I was really struck by the kind of uncomfortable presence of people in these histories. Because I mean, even in your own presentation, and this is not a criticism at all, but the people kind of show up, a good 10 or 15 minutes in, right? So you start with the natural beauty, and then eventually it's like, oh wait, there's people living there, right? And so I feel like there's something there about, and we've all sort of these discourses of like, the divisions between human and nature and how important these are, and all of that kind of stuff. But it also, your presentation really shows how those change over time. Super fascinating. And I guess that's a comment. I guess, and I would love to hear you say more about that kind of dynamic. And I'm also wondering if you have anything by the people who are living in the swamp that, I mean, are they producing any kind of histories or sort of, you know, identifying their place in the swamp, or what they think, where they think they should be headed at any point in time at all?
It's really interesting. I had not noticed that I had excluded people for that long, but it is, you are right. It is a very telling thing that people don't come in until quite into it. And I think perhaps it's because I've been looking at a lot at animals, you know, that I have been working on extinctions, and I've been more concerned about the fauna of because I mean there's no people, but there are a lot of birds and, you know, all kinds.
And it really, it's just it's really not a criticism. It's just this kind of like to play with like also just visibility and invisibility, right? Because the enslaved people who were going through were supposed to be invisible, right? Like that was the point of going through the swamp, right? So anyway, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, that's it's really interesting to kind of ponder why I've been excluding people from the first few pages. But I think it has been for two reasons. One is that nowadays, when you visit the Ciénaga, it's very controlled. So so most of the time, because when you go, or at least when I've gone, it's been mostly with birders, right? You don't get to meet a lot of people within what is now the national park. Because I've been focusing more on the kind of what I've called the long 19th century, right? With this kind of more modern coda, I'm still looking at things that happened 50 years ago, right? I mean, I'm still in the past, and so I haven't really the deepest conversations I've had about the transformative aspects of human, you know, human life in the Ciénaga had been mostly with those working with the crocodiles, you know, that because that is a place where you can sort of freely sit down and chat about, you can hear the really poignant and interesting, and sometimes really fascinating stories of the transformation of some of the workers at the facility from being hunters or being coal makers and into you know, so into this new work with conservation. And what has struck me the most about these narratives is that you know, repeated, the details may change, you know, and the personal experiences may change, but the narratives are very similar, you know, and they're sometimes have this arc of you know, we were almost of redemption. We were lost. We made charcoal. We destroyed the mangroves. We hunted. We made crocodile stew and whatever. And now, through the power of this, you know, education that we've had with, you know, we have actually seen the, you know, what our true focus should be, and now we're working with it. It was just a really fascinating narrative to hear repeatedly, right? And you try not to get completely absorbed in it, but it is actually very compelling because it's like there are all narratives of redemption, which I find fascinating. And you know, you hear the details, but now that generation is retiring from their work and dying out. So those that I have spoken with more younger groups are more urban, are living on the coast, a little off the reservation, the reserve, and they are mostly engaged either in nature work as guides, you talk to a lot of guides, and they all have their particular bird that they take you to see. I'm not a great photographer, but some of those photos from the birds were like about the best I've gotten, which is not that good. But all are engaged in talking about the history of the area through the arts, plays, music, dance performances, and so forth. So there is a creation of a new kind of response to the space, right? But I think I've been focused more on those sort of histories of. This is why I would love Pura's book, right? Because it is such a detailed account of her childhood in the Ciénaga. But the going back to look at more recent approaches would be really fascinating, because yeah. I can't hear you. Alejandra, we can't hear you.
I'm talking. Yeah. I'll stop talking after this. I was going to go off with the guy with the hill. Right, that one is crocodile almost, right? So you get these two narratives of the people and the animals, and they're like together in that one photograph. Is sort of very visually striking. But anyway,
I love
thank you
that
so much.
photograph. I definitely love that photograph because it's so inscrutable. I mean, you don't know. See a poacher. I mean, you see it's caring for. I mean, it's just a really inscrutable. And the straight gaze at the camera is particularly I mean, has a particular impact. But I mean, it's I mean, there's so much that can be done with this material, right? There is so much to look into, so much to, I mean, I'm convinced that there are narratives around that I have some film and some recordings of some of these conversations that I would like to go back and pour through and really get to look at more, more in depth. But you're right. I mean, the human history of the Ciénaga is particularly compelling, and perhaps less available to us than the fauna. You can. There are ornithologists writing about, more ornithologists writing about the Ciénaga than there are people, anthropologists writing about the Ciénaga. So it's really fascinating. Reinaldo, I mean, these stories, the kind of narrative trajectory that I'm finding, is that the same you're finding?
Yes. And that was one of my goals, how to trace from the late 19th century. But my focus is more after the 50s. But I came before from Cosculluela and others, different projects. Because I studied mainly the project to transform the swamp and how changed along the time and how changed the ideas. Because, for example, in the 50s, we don't have the Ramsar sites, for example, or this category, all this reconsideration of the swamp, the role of the swamp, mangrove, and how changed. And how change also the narrative around and the people living there. For example, I was thinking on the role of tourists today. Tourists that is very strong in some areas, Playa Larga, for example, and people winning a lot of money, and this is creating a difference between the Western Zapata swamp and the Eastern Zapata swamp, and our new process now that we are living today. But the role of tourists, as everywhere in the Caribbean, is very important in this discussion. And it's interesting that because the original idea from before the revolution and was materialized after the revolution was to create a different kind of tourist in contrast with the tourists so focused on Havana. And give me a minute because I have to connect the computer. If not, I will lose the connection and to connect again will be crazy. let me just a minute, but you can continue. You can
Go
continue.
ahead. Go ahead and
Go ahead and connect.
go ahead and make that connection. In the meantime, just the reference to, for those interested, the reference to Reinaldo's article is in Environmental History, volume 27, number 2 of April 2022. And the title is In Grave Danger, A Brief Environmental History of the Cuban Crocodile.
Oh, thanks so much.
So it is there, and I wonder if Reinaldo says that one of those articles. They ask me for something, and usually when they ask a scholar like that, it often turns out to be a very nice piece. I guess in the meantime, also it will be very interesting to think. If I don't remember, I think I remember maps of Cuba with the shape of a crocodile.
Yes.
In some of my
Yes,
archival
that's
research,
true.
which is another dimension to bringing into the sort of symbolic part of the cocodrilo, ¿no? El mapa de Cuba con como figura de cocodrilo, ¿no? Que that would be an interesting. I think I have seen it somewhere in
Es
the
cierto,
archives.
es cierto. Yeah, I have seen that. I have seen that. You know, the one of the things about the crocodile is, you know, that to me is so fascinating is the kind of doomed aspect of what Reinaldo called earlier, you know, this small population of Cuban crocodiles surrounded by this massive population and they are allopatric. I mean, they can breed with each other, which is you know, sort of a biological imperative that will probably end with its disappearance, right? But not enough to sort of transform them into a hybrid species where the Cuban crocodile is kind of half of the genetic material. But it's really interesting to you know, for me to look at the histories of extinctions in the Caribbean. I mean, this is something I've been working on, starting with the extinction of the monk seal, right, and the extinction of the macaws, and the famous non-barking dogs that Gonzalo Fernandez de Oviedo talks about going extinct in the early years of the conquest, and the fact that in most cases you can link these extinction processes to economic processes, right? To either pet trade and the impact of the combined pet trade, hunting, and deforestation. But in so many places in the Caribbean, you see this connection, right? That the species are not going extinct for reasons like the Cuban crocodile, right? Which is a kind of coming together with a more massive population, but are actually going extinct because of human reasons or human encroachment into the environment, which is what made for me that early experience of Martí on the edge of the Ciénaga interesting, right? The conjunction of the slave trade. He's been there at a time when the last Cuban red macaws are in existence. The ornithologists that are there to record that moment of endangerment for the bird. It's just sort of a little bit of you know, an Havana becomes then this sort of little crux of drama, right? Where the plantation is encroaching, the birds are going extinct, and they're trying to stop the slave trade. So, but all in this, I'm fascinated by geographical spaces that all of a sudden become the crux or kind of the crucible of really important places. And I mean, in some ways, I could have written about an Havana in the 1860s and made it about that, right? About the space as a geographical point of contact and conflict. But you can I don't know. I mean, I'm just really fascinated by how many points of contact like this we can identify throughout the region in a bunch of histories that have not been written, right? With a bunch of voices that have not been recovered or heard. And this is why things like this, I love that soap opera. I had to say, it's just really fascinating to watch how you imagine, right? I mean, how, but even from the point of view of how actors kind of imagine and seek to recreate spaces and conflicts and lives. It's really fascinating. But it's also, you see it and it's such a brochure for the place, right? You cannot watch it, and because it was filmed in the Ciénaga, you cannot watch it and then not go like, oh, that is beautiful. I want to go there, right? That is beautiful. Okay, so there's this canoe ride. I want to go there. Or there's swimming here. I want to go there, right? It's just it's beautiful. The birds sweep by and you say, okay, I want to go there. So I don't know if it was, it's almost like a tourist brochure for Cubans. Come and see the Ciénaga, the Zapata, now that it's been left alone to do its thing, and it's so beautiful. So, but as as Reinaldo says, it just reminds me of all this work that can be done, right? All this work that needs to be done, all these stories to explore and species to save and all that.
Gracias. Tenemos una pregunta en el chat que nos mueve un poco del tema más biológico a otros temas, que no deja de tocar la conexión del medio ambiente, el ser humano y la estrategia militar, que a algunos nos interesa mucho, ¿no? Y la pregunta es de Jorge, que la puedes hacer, ¿no? Jorge Nieves, si se conoce algo de algún uso militar que se le haya dado a la Ciénaga luego de la revolución. No sé si Reinaldo o Lisa.
¿Tú sabes de eso?
Bueno, en realidad seguro. Sí, hay uso militar en muchos lugares de Cuba, en cuevas, por ejemplo, lugares apartados. No tengo un estudio específico, pero seguramente hay lugares de la zona que su acceso sea más vedado. Tiene que ver un poco con lo que dices también, de cómo la población se fue relocalizando hacia las costas, y creo que después es decir, habría que hacer otra lectura adicional, pero también la guerra de independencia, porque en la guerra de independencia hubo mambises que utilizaron el paisaje de la Ciénaga para luchar con los españoles, es decir, que son muchas, y de hecho, algunos de los que venían en Playa Girón como asaltantes habían trabajado en los proyectos iniciales de la Ciénaga, y por eso conocían el lugar. En los proyectos que se hicieron a principios del año 59, que al mismo tiempo eran proyectos que venían de la década de 50 que se estaban manejando. Es decir, que todas esas historias son muy interesantes. ¿Por qué se decidió invadir por la Ciénaga y no otro lugar? Precisamente por esa larga historia de aislamiento de la Ciénaga como barrera. Entonces, es una variante también a estudiar en el tema, ¿no? Y respecto a la forma de Cuba como cocodrilo, es muy interesante. Aparecen los libros de geografía, habría que ver a partir de cuándo, pero también hay imágenes muy contradictorias sobre el mismo cocodrilo. Es decir, imágenes literarias, yo creo Manuel Cofiño, por ejemplo, más negativas sobre el cocodrilo o sobre la comparación de Cuba con el caimán, porque lo que representa el caimán en ese momento. Entonces es algo que se puede estudiar también en la literatura, ¿no? Cómo va cambiando la propia... Y hoy en día los ambientalistas adoran los cocodrilos. Y hay muchísimos grupos, que es algo que puedes incorporar también, muchísimos grupos ambientalistas que yo conozco por mi trabajo con la Fundación Núñez Jiménez, que se ocupan de la protección del cocodrilo cubano, de liberarlo de nuevo al ambiente y que puede ser una dimensión diferente, porque incluso hay pequeños documentales, pequeños materiales que están haciendo que te pueden ser muy útil. Déjame ver si te puedo enviar al link a alguno de ellos, porque han invitado hasta influencers para crear una nueva imagen, una nueva percepción del cocodrilo y explicarte por qué es tan importante ese trabajo con el cocodrilo cubano, ¿no?
Bueno,
Entonces hay montones de historias realmente y es excelente, ¿no? Poder compartir en muchos de estos temas. Y para Jorge, sin dudas en el futuro podría ser algo también a investigar el uso militar de muchos de estos ambientes naturales y cómo incluso pueden haber ayudado a su preservación en algunos casos, tanto en Puerto Rico como en Cuba o en Corea. Entonces es interesante. O por otra parte, pero no
el
conozco en
Pacífico, en
Cuba.
las Filipinas.
Claro, no conozco en Cuba que se haya utilizado, por ejemplo, como un área para prácticas militares y que haya un tipo de contaminación como se puede encontrar en zonas, tal vez del Canal de Panamá o de Puerto Rico mismo,
En Vieques,
Vieques, sí.
en Vieques. Entonces es interesante, ¿no? Introducir también en la discusión ese tema.
Sí, sí.
Quería añadir para Jorge la idea de que cuando tú viajas por la zona de la Ciénaga, no tanto en el parque, la zona más protegida, pero la iconografía militar está presente por todas partes, ¿no? Desde el museo en Playa Girón, que celebra la victoria de Playa Girón contra los invasores, pero rótulos por todas partes, o sea, grandes, lo que nosotros llamamos billboards, ¿no? Estos carteles inmensos que dicen no pasarán o de aquí no pasaron, ¿no? Hay una militarización en la iconografía del espacio, ¿no? Por las carreteras, como cosas pintadas en las paredes de edificios. Hay toda una celebración, ¿no? de la victoria de las fuerzas cubanas contra la invasión de Playa Girón, pero y hay una presencia militar, no necesariamente tremendamente marcada, pero es una costa importante, una costa que necesita protección, ¿no? A veces cuando he notado alguna presencia militar o le he ido a pedir direcciones a alguien en un camión militar o algo, le pregunto, bueno, ¿qué hacen por acá? Y me dice, aquí protegiendo que no entren drogas, pero hay una presencia, no sé si es mayor o menor que en otros espacios, pero en términos iconográficos, ¿no? El éxito de Playa Girón, hay una iconografía muy marcada militar de no pasarán, hasta aquí llegaron los invasores, pero hay una serie de carteles interesantes que marcan esa historia militar.
Muy bien. Tenemos tiempo para otras preguntas también. Una de las cosas, ahora que Jorge Nieves nos da las gracias, una de las cosas que me vino a la mente cuando Reinaldo trajo lo de los mambises, y esto puede ser de interés para Lisa o para otros que deseen hacer la investigación, pero el trabajo que yo hice es en Mayagüita o sobre Mayagüita, que también es un lugar que tiene ese apil tropical y turístico en un momento dado, con anuncios en el New York Times para llevar el turismo ahí antes de la revolución. Pero hay una historia del llamado Pelú de Mayagüita, que es esta figura que aparentemente era un mambí que se quedó desde la revolución y que luego salió y aparecía por allí, ¿no? Un poco quizás estoy pensando en cómo esos lugares que se proyectan como hacia el turismo externo, pero siempre tienen estas historias escondidas, casi mitológicas, ¿no? Está pensando en el Pelú de Mayagüita, que también se decía que era un mambí, o al menos esa era una de las narrativas dominantes. Y obviamente tiene un área tropical, ¿no? Los baños de Mayagüita, que había un resort turístico que todavía está allí, ¿no?
Interesante.
Sí, sí. preguntas o
San José del Lago se llama, creo, el resort, ¿no?
sí, exacto, sí. Que
De la
fue
década del 50 fue.
sí. Estaba el antropólogo Withers que yo he investigado,
Ajá, que estuvo por
estuvo
allá.
allí,
Sí, sí, sí.
estuvo por allí investigando, y se quedó allí. Se quedaba, iba al hotel y iba a la villa y iba
Así
para el
es.
hotel, de paracaídas, antropología de paracaídas.
Interesante.
Y había hasta un aeropuerto, yo creo, si mal no
Sí,
recuerdo.
sí, sí, era un poco otro tipo de modelo ecoturístico del que se creó después en Guamá, ¿no?
Sí,
Que era un poco más rústico, digamos, en comparación con San José del Lago.
sí, sí. Si tenemos alguna otra pregunta, comentario del público. No, pues entonces yo creo que hemos tenido una buena sesión, un buen diálogo fructífero, que yo espero que se vea reproducido en publicaciones futuras, o en encuentros o visitas
Jorge,
también.
dame un chance. Discúlpame de nuevo por esa demora, porque realmente no lo esperaba. Es decir, fue algo totalmente. Me fue difícil porque intentamos conectarnos por otra vía también. Y bueno, había terminado el otro compromiso muy poco tiempo antes y esperaba poder conectarme rápido, pero ya te digo. Entonces, tenerlos a todos ustedes, la paciencia de esperar realmente, Lisa, sobre todo, yo sé lo que eso representa para alguien cuando va a exponer, ¿no? Que tenga que entonces este tipo de inconvenientes tecnológicos, digamos, ¿no? Pero
Para nada.
No, no.
por suerte funcionó. Entonces,
Funcio-
muchísimas gracias por la invitación y la oportunidad de compartir con ustedes.
no, no.
Y bueno, que sean más en el futuro.
Sí, exacto, para nada la disculpa, porque si no el problema hubiera sido acá en Puerto Rico, que tenemos problemas eléctricos de todo tipo,
Ah, bueno,
e inesperados, así que
pues
aquí
eso va dentro de la
tuvimos,
historia ambiental del Caribe porque nos creemos que es único y
sí,
tenemos
sí,
apagones por todas partes. Bueno,
sí, sí, acá la conferencia Luis, que fue la semana pasada, la tuvimos que mover por un apagón,
bueno.
así que nada, eso no, esas cosas pasan y
Más, más historias ambientales y de adaptación.
sí, estamos en el Caribe, así que muchas gracias a todos, a las personas que nos acompañaron. La conferencia va a estar grabada, ¿no? Y la ponemos en el canal de YouTube del instituto. Así que, Lisa, gracias y nos veremos pronto.
Muchas
Esperamos
gracias
que
y
sí.
Reinaldo, mil gracias. Un placer, de verdad.
Sí. Y a Reinaldo también, pues esperamos que haya un encuentro también pronto, allá, acá o en Acuyá, como decimos por ahí. Gracias a nuestros visitantes que los vemos, Alejandra, Gastambide, Jorge y bueno, y hasta la próxima. Gracias a Emanuel
Bueno,
también por el apoyo técnico.
Gracias a
un
todos.
abrazo,
Reinaldo, mil gracias.
que todo vaya muy bien y que continuemos esta conversación.
Hasta luego.
Y
Esperemos.
otras.
Hasta
Chao,
luego.
chao. Gracias por todo. Chao.
Gracias.